All right, this lecture is going to be about the sex and gender. Again, gender, sexuality, and sexual orientation are major areas of research in my department. And in fact, over the course of my career, gender and men and women's obligations together, felt responsibility, and women's sense of entitlement as compared to men has been a really big part of my research interests. And so this topic is right in the heart of what I care about. I know it's a really important area of research and scholarship because there's many ways for you to study this here at BGSU. You can take women's studies courses, you can learn about masculinity studies, sex and gender is a component of ethnic studies as well. And so in this lecture, I'm going to be giving you kind of a historical context of the rise of womanist movements and also talk to you mainly about definitions, sociological definitions of different important aspects of sex and gender. And so you probably know, but sex and gender are kind of defined in two ways. Sex is considered to be your biological differences between males and females, and so it would be considered your genetic, physical, and hormonal kind of differences. There's some researchers who think that there's as many as 5 different kind of sexes, that there's different kind of combinations of our genetic and physical and hormonal appearance. But we understand that there's two major categories that we kind of see or interpret, and that's male and female sexes. Gender is the social and cultural significance that we attach to these presumed biological differences. And so it's the meanings that we put behind being in the category male or female. It's what we decide socially are the norms, the customs, the traditions, the behaviors, the attitudes that men and women should have to represent their gender. And so, of course, gender can really change over historical time, depending on the society you're in and the types of social movements that they're having, or the cultures and norms that they have. And so, what some symbolic interactionists argue is that people engage in gender displays. And so, West and Zimmerman, back in the 1980s, first kind of developed this concept. And what they meant is that, hey, you know what? In our day-to-day lives, we feel accountable for fulfilling appropriate gender scripts or displays. And so, in the back of our mind, we have a script for how we're supposed to behave. And so some of us who are pretty traditionally feminine, we may feel that we can't go outdoors unless our hair is made up and then we've got our makeup on. If we go to church, we need to wear lipstick. We have to wear nylon pantyhose if we're going into work or to church. Like, you can imagine the script that you might have in your head, right? Other people have gender script if they're more non-normative feminine. They might feel that they can wear what they want. They don't need to wear makeup, but that they're still kind of womanly or feminine overall. So at any rate, West and Zimmerman say that we have these scripts and that we feel that we have to be accountable when we run into people, that they're expecting us to display femininity or masculinity in a particular way. And so as we go out in the world and we're acting out these scripts, we get feedback from people. So they might give us dirty looks, or they might give us praise, or if we're traditionally feminine, maybe we'll be told that our haircut is beautiful, or if we're feminist and we don't really care about that, maybe we'll get a negative look by someone who's traditional, or if we're a feminist, we get a praise for our new tattoo that celebrates women's rights. Like, you can imagine the kinds of feedback that you're getting on a daily basis based on how you're performing gender, right? And so what this argument is, the symbolic interactionist theory is that at the same time we're giving cues, we're showing a specific kind of form of femininity, and that we are acknowledging that there are norms out there and that we're either trying to follow the norms or we're bucking the norms, challenging the norms, and that we're reading other people too. And so they argue that the social dynamics of gender are in interplay with people. So for example, my dad and I kind of struggled about what kind of a woman I was going to be while I was in college, and he was always asking me whether I was going to get married and have children, and I was always telling him that I didn't think so, that I was going to go on for higher education. And so he and I were kind of enacting kind of cues. And so his ideas shaped about what he normatively expected from me, but he still expects me to be a good daughter and help with taking care of things, right? Cooking and cleaning and that kind of thing. And so basically in our social interactions, we are creating gender on the spot, right? That there's really nothing attached to our sex that requires a certain kind of performance. It's just that within interactions, we're deciding what scripts we want to fulfill. And in different social contexts, we get different evaluations, either positive or negative, on the performance of them. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you a bit about the history of feminist movements or womanist movements in the United States. And so people generally talk about 3 major waves And to talk about it as a wave is really kind of doing it a disservice, because within each wave, it's a lot more complicated than just kind of one thing happening, one factor or one pattern. But basically, the first wave is the stage in which we're starting to think about women as having political equality. And so the first wave, we start really thinking of it occurring around 1848. It was a feminist movement in the United States. It started in upstate New York, in the town of Seneca Falls, and it was a group of women who got together, and men too, to try and write a statement about why women should have the right to vote and why women should be active participants in political life. And so you know that it took a long time for women to get the right to vote. And across different nations in the world, the timing of the vote was staggered at different time periods. And in some nations of the world, women still don't have the right to vote. But at any rate, women were struggling for the right to vote in the United States. Women were holding protests, they were holding marches, demonstrations. For a 15-year time period, there were groups, organized protests in front of the White House at all times. And so they were really pushing for it. They were writing newspaper articles about it. And even during this time period, Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president, she wasn't on a major ticket, Democrat or Republican, but she formed her own party and she ran for president. And so even before women had the right to vote, women were really pushing for political power. This was really kind of a highly contested moment in our history because you'll remember blacks didn't have the right to vote either. And so it became kind of a struggle during this time period about whether black men should attain suffrage, and therefore should women get the right to suffrage, should black women get the right to suffrage. And so there was this big dialogue about it, right? And so if you've ever paid attention to the history of it, you'll know that Frederick Douglass, he was really pushing for universal suffrage, for the right to vote for everyone. So at any rate, this stage of the feminist movement ended in 1920 when the constitutional amendment occurred, 19th Amendment, that granted us the right to vote. And so in this past election, we had an opportunity to elect a woman president, and now we turned down that opportunity. And so it means that if and when we do have a woman president, it will have been well over 100 years of women's right to vote before we've had a woman president. So it's kind of interesting to think about the flow of history, that even before women had the right to vote, a woman ran for president. We've gained the right to vote, and we still not had a woman's president, even though it's been about 100 years. Other nations in the world are getting their first women prime ministers, first chancellors, first presidents. And so it's kind of interesting to see political struggles overall. So these are first wave kind of political movements. The second wave of the feminist or womanist movement emerged in the 1960s and really came into full force in the 1970s. A lot of you probably remember your mothers or grandmothers talking about this. And so you started seeing women getting more voice politically, writing more kind of political and cultural commentary. And so Betty Friedan, for example, she was this woman she was a suburban housewife, and she was really uncomfortable or dissatisfied with her life. So she and her husband eventually divorced, and she went to graduate school, and she was trying to think about why she felt so out of place. And she realized this because as an adult woman, she was really isolated. She was separated from the public life, and her only kind of adult contact really was with her husband or was within kind of a hostess role, benefiting for her husband, like having parties. And so she realized that she was not the only one experiencing that. She called it the problem with no name. And so she really wrote about women needing to have a social, cultural, and political life on their own, right? And other women were writing in this time period too. So like Gloria Steinem started actively writing. Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, Shirley Chisholm, other women activists, they started to try to develop a trans-ethnic or pan-ethnic kind of womanist movement. And so they were gathering women to try to bring forward political requests to our state and federal governments demanding women's equal pay, women's right to higher education, the taking down of gender discrimination in social clubs, that kind of thing. And so they were trying to really kind of elevate awareness that women were really being sidelined in public life. But their biggest focus during this time period was on reproductive rights and control over women's bodies. And so they were fighting for the right to have abortion if they wanted it, abortion on demand. They were fighting for the right to cheap access to contraception. They were fighting for the right to have good research done on quality reproductive techniques in contraception. So they were really concerned about hormonal levels in the birth control pill and that kind of thing. And they are also aware that there was real profound inequalities around race. And so during this time period, it was kind of discovered that there were certain kind of government policies that were unfair. So, for example, Puerto Rican women were often sterilized when they were coming into the hospital to give birth to their babies. And there sometimes were these movements to sterilize them so they could not have many more children. And there were sterilization movements for women who are, had mental health problems. And so this wasn't a widespread problem, but it was discovered at times to be kind of a coordinated effort by government and or medical people. And so the feminist movement at this time was really kind of exploring this. How can we treat women and empower women to manage their bodies and to get the kind of healthcare, reproductive healthcare that they want? And you know that this is something that we're still debating, obviously, and really struggling with as a nation. That we're having a large debate about whether women should have their total control over their access to reproductive health, and whether we are trying to close down health clinics, we're trying to end government support of Planned Parenthood, whether we're making it very difficult to get abortion by having it so that more and more states are getting rid of their abortion clinics and reproductive health clinics. And so this is still a part of the feminist movement. This wave kind of really has not ended yet. But then, during the 1990s, the third wave of the feminist movement arose. And that's when feminism started to be more concerned with kind of the cultural sphere. And that we started to really acknowledge that there's not just one woman's movement. It's not just about Gloria Steinem or Betty Friedan. And meaning it's not just a white middle class or upper middle class woman's movement. And so they were trying to acknowledge black women, Latina women, gay and lesbian women more directly. They were trying to acknowledge the rise of transgender movements. They were trying to understand how women's movements in the United States connected to international women's movements and concerns about exploitation of women everywhere. And so you started to see the rise and embrace of multiplicity of voices, rise of different kinds of expressions of feminist movement, the celebration of difference, and then a real commitment to kind of a global perspective as we're thinking about social justice. And so what's interesting about this is that you can really see kind of this third wave in just the response to the election that we just had, right? And so in early January we had the day after the inauguration, we had this kind of international women's protest, right? And so we had March on Washington, D.C., and marches around the United States. We had marches in Toledo and Ann Arbor. And so women kind of collectively got together and men who were allies did. And so you saw kind of like as a cultural expression, the rise of the pussy hat phenomenon, right? This pink knit hat to kind of express women's control over their bodies and women's dissent and women's resistance against exploitation of women. So that's sort of interesting to think through women demanding a place in the cultural sphere and women acknowledging that there's more than one kind of woman and therefore a variety of different kinds of womanist or feminist experiences. You can see this if you ever take the time to read the platform for this Women's March, that they really tried to bring together a wide diversity of sponsors, women from all sorts of different kinds of perspectives, including even kind of conservative women for the movement. And so it's interesting to think about what this third wave is and about whether it's a kind of a coherent perspective or whether it's fractured across different kinds of feminisms. Anyway, let's start thinking more sociologically. So get back to definitions. So sexuality, we have sex and gender, right? And so we also have a sexual identity, and a sexual orientation. And so when we think about sexual identity, we think about how our social expression of our identity is situated within social, cultural, and historical processes. So for example, if you were a lesbian in the first part of the 20th century, there were laws that kind of said what you could wear. And so in Buffalo, New York, for example, they had really aggressive laws that described how many pieces of men's clothing you could wear if you were butch. And if you were wearing too many pieces of men's clothing, you could be arrested and taken to jail. And then also kind of restricting where you could go and trying to shut down gay bars. And so really, we have to think about this, like how our lives and how we get to express our sexual identity is really socially, culturally, and historically prescribed, right? And that's an important piece of it, to understand struggles over that. Sexual orientation is the categories of people to whom we're sexually attracted, right? And so research is really trying to tease out how much of our sexual orientation is biological, genetic, and hormonal in nature versus how much of it is choice and culturally constructed and personally chosen, or what kind of combination of both. But when we think about sexual orientation, there seems to be kind of four major categories that we discuss in the United States. And none of these labels for them are particularly great, but for our working understanding, we've got heterosexual, and that means sexually attracted to members of a different sex. So we try not to say opposite sex, but a lot of research sometimes still talks about opposite sex. But basically different sex, so men being attracted to women and women being attracted to men. And then we have homosexual, and that's sexual attraction to members of the same sex. So women being attracted to women and men to men. And that there's a lot of kind of cultural dialogue about what to call that. Is it gay experience? Is it lesbian or gay experience? There's one researcher called Judith Stacy who wants to call it lesbigay for acknowledging that you can have lesbian, bisexual, or gay kind of orientations. And so there's a lot of kind of challenging about what to call someone who's a homosexual. And it really depends on what community you're in. And bisexual means sexual attraction to both women and men. And transgender means you appear as one biological sex, but you identify with the gender of another. And so if you're transgender, it means you identify with the biological sex of a different sex. It doesn't necessarily mean you're doing anything about it, like changing your appearance or modifying your body. But often people are. They're either modifying their appearance through superficial ways, like through makeup or clothing, or they are going through hormonal and surgical procedures to alter their body to more match their identification. So that's kind of the broad categories. There's also kind of categories of trying to understand if people are cis categories. So cis meaning, were you born that way and stayed that way, or were you born one way and moving on to another? And so if I were to say I'm a cis woman, it means that, or cis heterosexual, it means that I was born a heterosexual woman and I've been kind of staying that way. And so it's interesting to think about cisgender as well. So I'm going to be presenting to you a few little pieces of research about sexual activity. I'm not going to be talking a whole lot about, not talking at all about sexually transmitted disease or anything. I'm just talking about sexual behavior, sexual debut. And I'm going to be talking to you from research that was published in 2013 with data that's it's a national sample of U.S. people. And so it represents the United States. And so it's relatively recent data. It's 2006 to 2010. And the study was in 2013, and the data set is the National Survey of Family and Growth. And so this graph makes me really irritated because as I translated the graph from PowerPoint to Keynote and Apple, it lost some of the headings. So I'll have to describe some of the key headers below. But anyway, this is trying to look at what's the lifetime sexual behavior of people who are aged 25 to 44. And so people who have kind of started their sexual activity through kind of mid-adulthood. And so the first two columns are for vaginal with someone of the different sex. And so you've engaged in vaginal sex. If you're a woman, you've had sex with a man. If you're a man, you've had sex with a woman that included penetration. The second column that didn't get a label is oral sex with someone of a different sex. That OS is standing for opposite sex, but I'd prefer that you think of it as different sex. So that second set of columns is whether you have put your mouth on someone else's genitals for their pleasure, or had them put their mouth on you. And so oral sex is kind of looked at as it could occur in either direction or maybe even both. That third column is anal sex with someone of a different sex. And then that fourth column that's not labeled unfortunately is not labeled, is if you've ever had a sexual experience, sexual activity with someone of the same sex. And so what you can see is that for adult men and women, the vast majority are reporting vaginal sex. And so 97% of men and 98% of women in adult life report that they have had vaginal sex. For oral sex, there looks like there's a slight, very slight, very, very, very slight, I would say it's practically the same, that 91% of men and 89% of women report that they've had oral sex. You start seeing a gender difference when you start seeing anal sex. And so it looks as though 45% of men say that they've penetrated a woman for anal sex, and only 37% of women report that they've been penetrated or engaged in anal sex. And so this is starting to show anal sex is less likely than oral and vaginal sex, and it looks like there's a gender difference. Now, when you look at same-sex sexual activity, that's when you start seeing a real gender difference. So 6% of men in the United States report that they have had same-sex sexual activity, and 13% of women have. And in fact, that gender difference is really significant. It's meaningful. It does look as though women are twice as likely to have had experienced same-sex sexual experiences. Now, some of those women and some of those men, they're from homosexual or bisexually identified people, right? But some of that sexual activity includes people who define themselves as heterosexual and then have either engaged in it, not necessarily identifying with homosexual activity, or maybe identifying for a while. And I guess you could figure that out yourself because, again, 98% of women report having had vaginal sex, and 13% of women report having same-sex sex. Okay, so the next graph I want to show you is the lifetime number of opposite-sex partners for people who are age 15 to 44. And so it's dropping the age range down to try to acknowledge that a lot of people start their sexual activity at relatively young ages in their teen years. And so the top row, 0, 1, 2, 3 to 6, 7 to 14, and 15 plus, is showing you the number of lifetime partners. So 0 are those who have not started their sexual activity. 1 is that they've only had one partner. 2 is 2 partners, all the way to 15 partners or more. And so the interesting thing is only about 11% or so of both women and men who are age 15 to 44 report that they've never had sex with someone of a different sex. They've never had sex with the opposite sex, right? And then when you look at it, 20% of women say that they have had one partner, and 14% of men say that they've had one partner. The modal category for adult women and men is 3 to 6 partners. And so 1/3 of women, 32%, and 27% of men report that they've been in the 3 to 6 partner range in their adult life. And what you see is that men are far more likely, more than double, to have had 15 or more partners. So 21 or 22% of men report that they've had 15 or more partners, whereas only 9% of women report that many partners. And so it's interesting to kind of look at the gender differences here, where women and men are the same, where they're the same at the lower ends, and then it looks as though they start diverging in sexual activity at higher numbers of partners. The last thing I kind of want to show you is the percentage who have had no opposite sex sexual partner by age. And I really specifically wanted to look at young people. And so this is looking at people aged 15 to 19 and then aged 20 to 24. And so when you look at age 15 to 19, you see that 47% of women and 44% of men have not had a sexual partner. And so one important point of that is that even at this age range, 15 to 19, the majority of women and men have had sex with an opposite sex partner. And so, of course, a lot of that is by people who are having a sex, at 17, 18, and 19, rather than 15 and 16. But still, among people aged 15 and 19, the majority have had sex. And it looks as though, although women are less likely to have had sex, that men and women are pretty much the same. As soon as you enter the age range of 20 to 24, that drops down considerably. And so 10% of women and 13% of men have not had a sexual partner within that 20 to 24 age range. And so 90% of young people will have engaged in sexual activity by the time they reach 24. So that's all I kind of wanted to say about sexual activity, to kind of have you sort of thinking about sexual orientation, sexual activity, and what it all means. Sexual identity. And so what I want to talk to you about as I end this is to kind of think about gender theories for how we can think about how society is interested in controlling how we express gender and the gender rules and norms we have to follow. And so there's this really kind of term, there's a couple terms I'm going to define. One is called heteronormativity. And so heteronormativity is the cultural presupposition that heterosexuality is appropriate standard for sexual identity and practice, and that alternative sexualities are deviant, abnormal, or wrong. And so I don't if you remember from the earlier chapter or earlier lectures, I was talking about ethnocentrism, where you judge another culture through your own lens, and that you judge them negatively because they're not following your cultural norms. And so heteronormativity is that way, that if you are a heterosexual, if you judge homosexual or bisexual or transgender people negatively and put either a moral or a negative belief judgment on them, you may be engaging in a form of ethnocentrism. And so this argues that differences in sexuality are connected to really larger systems of power in which some systems are privileged. So, for example, this is going to be a very controversial example, but Ivanka Trump is working to try to help with family issues. She's very concerned with family issues, and one of the issues is childcare, right? And so she's starting to develop policies, and in her first earliest iterations, she's been talking about how she wants to have childcare in place for working mothers. And so in her mind, she was kind of thinking about working married mothers, and it became very clear that she didn't see policies for single mothers or childcare policies where men could take off time from work and not be punished by employers, or even thinking about how lesbians and gays would access childcare. And so some people were looking at that and saying this is an example of heteronormativity, right? Others are saying that no, she's just trying to start from somewhere. She's starting out with kind of married couples and trying to think about what she might do to help, right? And so basically, heteronormativity is kind of judging others from a heterosexual perspective and not necessarily seeing how different institutions, different laws, different parts of our society privileges heterosexuality. Another example would be kind of religion. So some religions are really aggressive about their moral codes or their scripture codes or their practices and traditions at kind of really celebrating heterosexual unions, right? And so some churches, even if there's marriage equality now legally in the land, they won't perform gay marriages. And so that would be kind of examples of heteronormativity. Compulsory heterosexuality is that this notion that, that your sexuality is not really chosen. You have a sexual identity, but society is going to force heterosexuality on you. And so you're kind of typecast. The stereotype is the natural inclination and the obligation to society should be attraction between sexes, men with women and women with men. And so those who differ from this normalcy, from wanting to be inclined or wanting to have heterosexuality, are going to be marked as deviant or abhorrent. And so Adrienne Rich is a feminist scholar who is writing about this. She wrote about what she calls compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence. And so she talks about compulsory heterosexuality as a political institution. So our religious codes that promote heterosexuality, our legal codes that treat gays and lesbians differently, that deny them access to marriage, that sometimes deny them access to adoption, that don't permit, at one time didn't permit gay people to marry, and therefore, since they weren't married and considered family, wouldn't permit them to visit their partners who were sick or dying in hospitals. And so these would be examples about compulsory heterosexuality, punishing people or denying them rights and privileges that heterosexuals take for granted. An example would be during the 1970s and 1980s, and especially as the AIDS crisis increased, a lot of gay men were not getting quality access to health care, right? They couldn't access health care as a married couple. They weren't allowed to marry. And then also, if a partner was sick at the hospital with AIDS, it wasn't clear that another partner would be able to come in and visit, that they didn't have maybe the legal rights to it. And so what you were finding is that, and also another problem was that the laws were set up, housing laws were set up, so that only if a married partner dies, then a married person could keep the rental agreement. But if people are cohabiting or they look like they're just living together as roommates, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'd be able to keep the lease. And that landlords were often wanting to kick out gay people whose partners had died because they would be able to raise rents for the next people they rented it to. And so the solution against this compulsory heterosexuality for some men in New York City was to adopt each other, to have to legally adopt each other as almost they were children to each other in order to be able to have family rights, to be able to say, hey, we're a family, you can't treat our rental agreement differently. Hey, we are family, you should let me see him in the hospital when he's sick. And so those are examples of compulsory heterosexuality. So Gail Rubin studied this as the sex-gender system. And what she says, it's really interesting to study the set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological sex into products of human activity. And so gender is a socially imposed division of the sexes. And so basically she's looking at how the things we do around gender. So how we, make an industry where we're making lipsticks and eyelashes. We have different kinds of eyeliner and brow, brushes. We have different fashion for our dress. We have different body modifications, surgical body modifications. We have, even for children, different colored Legos, pink Legos for girls, and different bow and arrows. Girls get pink and purple bow and arrows. Boys get camouflage. And so she looks at that, the activity that we use where we're taking biological sex and we're making really gendered constructions around it. So children who are 5 to 7, there's no real difference between them, right? Boys and girls. Why do they need different colored toys, right? Or even different types of toys? And so she studies this. She's really interested in this. And so what she says is that in our contemporary society at the end of the 20th century, compulsory heterosexuality is really actively producing a form of gender in which women are consigned to secondary position in human relations. And so we're supposed to be more of the caretakers at home. We're supposed to be the ones who are more likely to leave the workplace to care for elderly people or children. We're supposed to kind of relatively accept lower wages for the work that we do. That we can face different kinds of forms of sexism, and so they argue that that's how our sex and gender system works. She says that there have been other sex gender systems where women and men have been more equal, and that it's even possible to envision societies in which women are in the superior position, but in ours in particular, women are in a secondary position. Now, I want to talk to you about Robert Connell, R.W. Connell. And so here's a scholar, he's kind of interesting. Back in the 70s and 80s, he was publishing and writing as Robert Connell. He was a transgender person, that he was a man, but he identified as a woman. And so over the course of his academic career, he's aligned his physical body with his orientation. And so he's gone through a transgender change, and now he's physically a woman, and also has changed his name to Raewyn. And so he's gone from Robert to Raewyn Connell. But at any rate, Raewyn Connell has been writing a great deal about what is called hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity. And so what Connell says is that there are institutions that control both women and men. And it's interesting to look at them. So there's the family as an institution, there's the government as an institution, there are the economy as the institution, and he even talks about the streets, how we monitor each other on the streets. So are men likely to wolf whistle or make women feel uncomfortable? How do women treat men on the streets? And so he talks about it as labor, power, and cathexis. And so by that, Raewyn Connell means labor, meaning the work we do. Are women more likely to be doing more of the child care, that kind of thing, or work in the marketplace? Power, are we able to get what we want politically? And cathexis, meaning society's pressures about who we're allowed to love, who we're allowed to feel intimate and close to. And Raewyn Connell thinks that those are 3 really important axes to study. What women and men do, what power women and men have, and how they're encouraged, who they're encouraged to love in life. So very, very bad. I started studying Connell way back in graduate school, so I kind of identified with him as Robert Connell. It's hard for me to catch up. Raewyn Connell wrote about hegemonic masculinity. And hegemonic masculinity is an idealized type of masculinity that's dominant. And so there's not very few men who actually fulfill this model. And so it's, for example, it's kind of an idealized model of what masculinity should be. And so it's thinking through, is it Iron Man? Is it Captain America? Is it Thor? Is it Rambo? A really strong and virile and muscular man who's able to do whatever he wants and is always saving the day. Is it that kind of masculinity? And so we have this vision of hegemonic masculinity of an empowered, almost militarized man. And so there's very few, if any, men who are actually that level of strong and powerful, right? But we kind of hold that model up as an ideal. And then for femininity, we have emphasized femininity. And therefore, it's talked about as women's qualities defined in relation to men as inferior or subordinate to men. And that what Connell said is that there's no form of femininity that places women in control of others. And so, of course, hegemonic masculinity is about a man always being in charge of the social scene and saving the day, and that you really can't imagine a woman in that kind of role. Like, no Captain America is a woman. And so, of course, that Connell argues that there's no form of femininity in which women are politically empowered and have better labor arrangements than do men. More recent forms of this model, like for example by Mimi Shippers at Tulane University, argues that maybe there is hegemonic femininity. Maybe we are starting to see the rise of femininities that give women real power and sometimes more power than men. And so she was trying to kind of stake or articulate what would what would a hegemonic femininity be. The last thing Connell talks about is marginalized or subordinated masculinities. And by this, Connell means if you're not fulfilling the hegemonic masculinity and you're not in control of the dominant institutions of society, then you're likely to be marginalized and probably mistreated. And so in these categories, he's thinking about gay men, maybe racial and ethnic minority men who are not treated as well as white upper class men, and other forms of masculinities that may have more power than women, but are not benefiting from compulsory heterosexuality and hegemonic masculinity in the same way as men. Now, I think an interesting thing about this, I know this is kind of maybe sounding extreme to you if you've never heard of these ideas before, but one thing Connell wrote about is what Connell called the gender dividend. And so what Ray Connell talked about was you can be a really decent man. You can be a loving father and a good husband and a hard worker, a provider. You can endorse your wife's place as a working woman. You can enjoy her speaking out and taking on roles in public life, but still get a benefit from the wide system of the sex-gender system and still get a benefit from women being treated as secondary citizens as compared to men. And so while you may look like you're egalitarian in your own personal relationships, you're still likely to be paid more than women on average. You're still likely to be given greater chances at promotion. You're still likely to be treated like the provider, even if you're a co-provider along with your wife. And you're still likely to kind of get a better treatment by your community as a head of the family. And so Connell wants to look at that, this dynamic of how do you move towards a more egalitarian world if there's a kind of dividends that you, even if as an individual you become more egalitarian, the system still ends up benefiting some people more than others. So I'm just leaving you with those kind of ideas to think or consider about. The last few things I want to talk about are sexism and discrimination, and then ways we can maybe perceive sexism and discrimination in society. So sexism is an ideology that one sex is superior to the other. And very few people nowadays in surveys report that they're sexist. However, there is really interesting research that looks at kind of ambivalence towards women, like feelings of not being certain whether women should be able to have it all or certain that women should be leaders. So there's research on that, and it shows that a lot of people are ambivalent about the gains that women have made. And then there's more research on hostility towards women, like anger at women. And it looks like there's a significant proportion of the population that really are angry about women's gains, right? And so fewer people are admitting to be sexist, but there are people who report being ambivalent about women's rights and concerned and angry about women's gains and a perception that maybe women are making more gains than men. So I study attitudes. I think this is really interesting. So anyway, there's sexism, and then there's institutional discrimination. And that's a pattern of treatment that systematically denies a group access to resources and opportunities as part of society's normal operations. So a feminist, for example, would argue that when the state and federal government works to restrict women's access to abortion or requires that they get permission from husbands or requires that they go through vaginal ultrasounds before they can seek an abortion or, places restrictions on their health care or their reproductive health care, that's an example of institutional discrimination. I'm not saying that you should agree with that or not. I'm just trying to get you to kind of understand what that term means from a sociologist's perspective. So the last two things I want to talk about are, labor force participation and income and wealth inequality. And then I want to talk about kind of violence against women. So there's these two terms, the glass ceiling and the glass elevator. The glass ceiling is an invisible barrier that blocks the promotion of a qualified individual in a work environment because of gender, race, or ethnicity. And so it means that you can get promoted up the ladder, but eventually there's going to be a place that you just are not rising above it anymore. So for example, very few women, even though more and more women are becoming very highly educated, very few women are reaching the very, very echelons, the highest regions of chief executive officers, chief financial officers, of Fortune 500 companies, for example. Glass elevators are an invisible ladder that helps the promotion of individual man, qualified or not, into a work environment that's gender segregated as stereotypically female. So the example I would give you is there's this man, a scholar, Jerry Jacobs, and he researches this. And so he's interested in this notion of how we get a more egalitarian society. Well, one way is we know that women are moving into male stereotypical jobs in great numbers. We know that the majority of people who go to college now are women. We know that women are surging as part of the law, going to law school and medical school. And so women really are moving into more male-defined professions, including in construction, any kind of field that you can think of. And so he wanted to study what happens when men start moving into female stereotypical jobs. And so as men start trying to become nurses, registered nurses or teachers. And what he found in doing that research is that even if a man wants to be a teacher, he is really rapidly promoted. And so he might be promoted really rapidly to principal or superintendent, even if his intention was to be an elementary school teacher or a high school teacher. And that what is routinely found in Jerry Jacobs' research is not only are they going to be relatively more quickly promoted than are women, but they're likely to be more quickly promoted than women, even when they don't have the same qualifications, education, or length of experience. And so it looks as though these female stereotypical settings are kind of hinged towards wanting to promote men into more leadership roles, more dominant roles within them. And so that would be an example of the glass elevator. The last thing I want to talk about is violence against women. And I shouldn't sound so breezy as I say that. The violence against women, it's hard to study this. Many crimes go unreported. You'll remember that when I was talking to you about crime and deviance. A lot of our crimes that occur are violence against women. We often engage in victim blaming and say it's because of their choices, what they wore, what they did. And so we often can't confront what violence against women is. Some forms of violence against women are really difficult to measure. So, for example, sex trafficking. This is an incredibly lucrative industry that crosses national boundaries and is a well-coordinated kind of systematic oppression of women. And it's really hard to measure how many women pass through it and how many children pass through it in any given year, and how and whether they escape from it. And so the types of violence, and there are many different kinds, and there's more than just here, are things like sexual assault and rape, honor killings. So, for example, some nations where if a woman is sexually assaulted, it's considered she's dishonored the family, and the family can only assert their honor if they kill her. And so this would include whether she was raped or whether she engaged in an affair or whether she engaged in premarital sex, that her sexual activity is considered a dishonor even if the sexual activity is against her will. Intimate partner violence, economic and educational violence. So, for example, a lot of feminists argue that the high cost of education and women's less access to education is a form of violence. Sex trafficking, enslavement, sexual enslavement, differential treatment in families. So, for example, in some countries, there's very little access to health care, and so often families are willing to take their sons but not daughters for health care. In some countries, they're more likely to pay for their sons' higher education. There's some countries in which even daughters are expected to work and give money to the family in order to use to pay for sons' educations. So those are examples of differential treatment. Sex-selective abortion or female infanticide. So I don't know if you know about it, but a lot of nations really have a son preference, right? They want to have a son. And they're going to have very few children. So like China has a one-child family policy. They've kind of loosened the restrictions so they now can have more than one child, but a lot of Asian countries want to have very few children. And so if they have a preference for sons, a lot of these nations are now using ultrasound technologies to find out if their fetus is a female fetus. And that some families are using sex-selective abortion to make sure that they have the number of sons they want before they end their reproductive career. And so they think that as many as more than 1 million girls each year, female fetuses each year, are aborted. And so that would be an example of sex-selective, gendered violence against women or the girl child. And then there's forms of political exclusion. So PERDA, the exclusion of women from public life, and requiring that women can only go out in public if they're chaperoned by a male family member, denied access to employment or education, the inability to vote. And so I would just kind of throw that out there to think through, where do you, when you're thinking about violence against women, how do you envision it, or what are you thinking about? And I know that on any one of these given subtopics, we could talk about inequalities and violence against men too, but the United Nations and a variety of agencies like the World Bank, they're trying to address kind of the disproportionate level of fatal and injurious violence that's aimed at women as compared to men. So that's it for my gender lecture. Man, you could take an entire course on this topic alone, and our department has one. So I hope that you'll consider taking this course in the future.